Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues and honored guests, thank you for giving your attention to this important matter this morning. We are joined today in the chamber and in the gallery by Blue Water Navy Vietnam veterans. At the conclusion of this resolution, I will ask you to help me welcome them here to the Senate, but I wanted you to know they are here. Since our country was founded, we have sent soldiers to war. As early as 1798, we started sending Americans overseas to protect America and our freedoms, to defend our allies, and to rid the world of dictators, criminals, communists, and terrorists. After the First and Second World Wars, the brave soldiers who'd gone overseas to fight were welcomed home with parades and rallies, with fanfare and appreciation. They are America's heroes, and we treated them with honor when they returned. Then came Vietnam. Our country was in a very different place, and some citizens protested the government's decision to send our soldiers to Vietnam. That right to protest, in fact, is one of the rights our soldiers had fought and died for in the early wars of our country. But for some, protest of the government turned into disdain for the soldiers. Our soldiers, our men and women, were not welcomed home. They were not treated as heroes. In my opinion, this was a very dark time in American history. As you heard in the resolution this morning, in 1991, Congress passed the Agent Orange Act, which addressed the plight of veterans impacted by toxic exposure in Vietnam between 62 and 75. Our government recognized these veterans were getting sick as a result of their service in Vietnam. But then, to add insult to injury, in 2002, some 11 years later, the VA changed the rules and determined that unless a soldier had boots on the ground in Vietnam and could prove it, they were no longer going to receive care for exposure to Agent Orange. It's as if the VA truly believes the chemicals sprayed over Vietnam didn't land in the rivers, didn't travel on a breeze into the ocean or onto the soldiers' food and water source. The military men and women who served in the submarines, on the Navy ships, and in our special forces out in the blue water know they were exposed to Agent Orange. The VA wants us to believe there was a magic wall around the border of Vietnam which contained all of the sprayed dioxin on the land. So in 2002, they started denying medical care and medical coverage to soldiers like these Blue Water Navy veterans. You're going to hear some testimonies of Blue Water Navy veterans and their families who are suffering from exposure to Agent Orange, just as their in-country brothers in arms who served on land are. So I'll turn the mic over to some of my colleagues to speak, and then we'll welcome them all here.
Senator Marble.
Thank you, Mr. President. One of the first things we have to do is understand the absurdity of this issue. When a Navy ship was tied to a pier in a Vietnamese harbor and a sailor did not stand on the pier or shore, he is denied VA benefits for any Agent Orange disease he later develops. This denial happens even if the harbor was surrounded on 3 sides by land. However, if a shipmate disembarked and stood on the pier, that shipmate on the pier is given full presumption of exposure and all benefits. Meanwhile, the sailor who stayed on board the ship only 2 to 5 feet away is denied the presumption of exposure and receives none of the benefits. The difference between the blue and brown water veterans. It is important to note the difference between blue and brown water sailors. Brown water refers to ships that served within the geographical boundaries of Vietnam, and blue water sailors served only offshore of Vietnam. Brown sailors were on the rivers and tributaries. Blue water sailors were on the open ocean and in the harbors and along the borders of Vietnam.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm going to start out by telling you how, kind of a brief story. I'm connected with the American Legion in Alamos, and what we would do a lot of funerals. And at these funerals, what you do is you present the flag. And what you do is you basically say, on behalf of the President of the United States and veteran service groups throughout the country, we would like to present this to the family of the fallen veteran. And then what we do is we take that flag and we give it to the spouse or the family member, and then we salute them. And when we salute them, we say, "From a grateful nation." And that's the point I'm trying to make, from a grateful nation. I am a Vietnam veteran myself. I'm in the United States Army. It's too bad we cannot put on here the emphasis on how upsetting this is to have to run this, because the reality is the Blue Water veterans have as much right to presumptive as anybody on land or brown water. And this should have never been taken off in 2002, and it should be put back on. There's enough evidence in place from the Australian government and from actually the South Korean government. You know, and it's a sad travesty when our own government does not recognize blue water. The reality of what blue water, the previous speaker told you the difference between blue and brown. Brown water was up in the waterways. You know, there were boots on the ground. The thing with blue water, as they sprayed this 22 million gallons of herbicide on the land, it all washed into the bays, the China Sea and whatnot. The ships that these guys represent, their water supply was taken out of the same bay that the dioxin was going in. And that's why they, you know, by all means, they should be getting this presumptive. Now, presumptive, basically what that does, and I was also a veteran service officer, what the presumptive does is basically the proof is laid in an act that nobody has to prove that they were. All they had to do is prove that they were on the ship in that bay at a certain time. But it's presumed that because they're on the ship, that they should qualify for benefits from the VA. And that's the difference between, that's what the key word to this whole thing is, presumptive. You know, I worked with it a lot, and the reality is, you know, you can put a claim in with the VA, but without that presumptive, it makes it very difficult. And that's the problem we have with this. But the reality is, if we're going to talk from a grateful nation, this should be allocated to the Blue Water Navy also. And, you know, I just think it's a travesty that it's not. But, you know, the Navy has a very proud history in this country. And one of those things that I've learned recently, since I've been up here, is to the extent that we owe the United States Navy. In World War II, when they landed the beaches on Omaha and Normandy, it was a slaughterhouse out there for the military that was on the beach. So what the reality of what you had is you had the naval big ships that were outward, and their duty was basically to watch the backside, so nobody would fly in and bomb us. What these admirals did, they went against orders. They saw the carnage going on the beaches, and they actually motivated their ships in close to land and opened that up so the military could actually advance on land. So the reality is we owe so much to the United States Navy for what they did for the ground forces in World War II. But, you know, you know, right now we're looking at the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War coming up this summer. And I think, you know, part of that anniversary gift should be from the VA to actually enact this to be presumptive. But, you know, I would encourage any Blue Water to keep trying, to keep, you know, putting those claims in. You know, the reality is, what we're talking about on the claim, you have to have the disease before you put the claim in. You don't just put the claim in and not have a disease. So the care and benefits from the VA are essential to all veterans, especially the Vietnam veteran. And that may be an overstatement. It should be care for all veterans. But, you know, the homecoming was not that great back in the 70s when I got back. I was there in '69. But the reality of what we've done, a lot of us have not dwelled on the homecoming. What we've done is we've said, okay, we know what happened to us. We want to make sure it does not happen to the next group. And we've dedicated you know, our lives to make sure that the next group of veterans that come back from a war, popular or otherwise, are very welcomed in this country. You know, the veterans, you know, we owe everything that we have to the veteran. And I don't just say that idly, I mean it. But I do believe in this, Senate resolution, and I urge you to vote for it. And I'm really glad that the sponsor brought this forward. But, you know, it's not meant to be, you know, it's something that has to be done. And it's not, you know, we as Vietnam veterans should not have to beg for anything. You know, what we're talking about is from a grateful nation. And that's what we expect, and that's what we demand. We demand all the rights that all the other veterans have. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. And Blue Water, guys, hoo-yah!
Thank you, Mr. President. I too rise in support of this, and I wanted to read something that was provided. Navy ships during the Vietnam era took in ocean water, ran it through a desalination procedure, and used it for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and bathing. Agent Orange flowed from the inland rivers and streams out to the ocean. The Agent Orange sprayed in the air also drifted with the wind into the ocean. When a ship collected water for in-ship use, the Agent Orange mixed with fuel oil, and it would coat the inside of the drinking system pipes and tanks within the ship. So all the water became polluted with Agent Orange. Every sailor on the ship was exposed and contaminated by Agent Orange, whether they stepped foot on land or not. According to the Agent Orange Act of 1991, anyone that qualifies for presumptive status should only have to provide a statement that they were one of the ones who went ashore, end of story. However, the VA keeps asking our veterans to prove that they went ashore and are denying coverage for those out in the contaminated blue water. Just simply not right. As one USS, and I hope I don't massacre this name, Ponchatoula sailor paraphrased Kenny Rogers from a song, "It wasn't us who started that crazy Asian war, still we proudly went and did our patriotic duty and did our patriotic shore. We Ponchatoula guys have to stick together. There will never be any more of us." And it's a shame that our Vietnam veterans were treated the way they were when they came home from the war, because they fought for our rights and freedoms that all of us sitting in this room have a right to every single day.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in support of this resolution as well. I have a couple of observations. You know, if you go to an airport today and you see members of the military flying to and from different cities, most often they're in uniform, and most often you compliment them and thank them for their service, and there's a real high regard and respect for who they are and what they're doing. I remember back in the days of Vietnam, it was quite different, and most remarkably, I saw this when my father and I, it was in the late 60s, I think I was in high school, my father and I went out to then Stapleton Airport to welcome back and pick up a cousin who had just completed his tour in Vietnam. And it was such a stark difference than what we see today, because we met him at the gate. Well, right there, that's a difference. We don't meet anybody at the gate. But we met him at the gate, and there was no fanfare. It was just the two of us saying, "Welcome back." He was not in uniform. He was in civilian clothes. And he, you know, rather quietly walked with us out of the airport, and he said, "The first thing I want to do is find a dentist to get my teeth cleaned." And a couple of things here. One is, he said anybody who was over in Vietnam had this black deposit that developed around their teeth because of the quality of the water. And he said, "I don't want to be seen as somebody who just came back from Vietnam." He just wanted to bury that and just walk away from it as quickly as possible. And that struck me as being just so wrong. And also note, though, that was the quality of the water. That was just a reality of what everybody endured. And the presence of these toxins from the Agent Orange was quite apparent. And the second thing I have today is a story from a Navy Blue Water veteran from Vietnam, and it's written in first person. It goes this way: "My name is Tom. I have an appeal coming up in the next few months stating that heavy smoke from fires on land covered the ship. Brownwater sailors would tie up to our jungle deck while we were in market time, and they'd shower and eat, then get back on their boats and leave. I had lunch with one of these guys and asked about where all the smoke was coming from. He answered saying, planes sprayed the jungle, and after the jungle died and dried, planes would then drop incendiaries and burn the jungle. Our ship sailed through heavy smoke, many times heavier than what it would take to blot out the sun. The VA's own literature says if you burn material exposed to herbicide, burning it releases it back into the smoke and the ash. All that said, they have ignored anything about smoke and Agent Orange. This is my second appeal, and I have a chance to introduce new evidence. If you have anything I can add, I'd love to present it to those hard-of-hearing good old boys.
Thank you, Mr. President. I too rise in support of resolution number 2. I want to thank the senator for Jefferson County for making this happen. I'm really simply going to read a statement from a Vietnam Blue Water veteran. Quote, I am fighting my 3rd stage 4 cancer. One of my latest doctors was really grilling me about Agent Orange on our ship and if I was ever in country. I told him I never set foot in country, but that I do remember the barrels we stored on deck. Having worked in the petroleum industry prior to enlistment, I spotted strange markings on the barrels and knew to stay away. Is there any update on the Blue Water Navy bill? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I too rise in support of SR 2. At 55, I'm part of a generation that I believe was the first to watch war on the evening news. My father was press secretary for the Secretary of Interior in 1969 under President Nixon, so watching the evening news was something that my family was somewhat required to do. War was not something that we idolized in movies. It was real. To see the bombing runs and different action in Vietnam on the evening news and people like Walter Cronkite relating the reality of war, I believe that that was very different for my generation. I remember older brothers being drafted or enlisting, cousins. Again, as a perspective of a child, it wasn't fathers so much, but cousins and older brothers. I have a testimony here from David, who served on the USS Ponchatoula. David states, I've been under the weather with chemo. I feel weak all the time. Seems I'm losing my strength. I finally heard from the VA and was classified as 100% disabled. It's a shame that the VA has taken so long to approve my case. For my wife's sake, I'm thankful it was approved. Seems my illness is only worth about $3,000 a month to the VA at 100% disabled. Very sad that that's all my life is worth to the VA. To David and others who served on the Ponchatoula and in the war in Vietnam, your worth is far greater than that in the eyes of this child of the late 60s and early 70s. God bless you. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also rise in support of SR 002. I also have a testimony here from another Vietnam Blue Water veteran. It says, I served aboard the USS Ponchatoula from August 69 to December 71. I am currently filing paperwork with the VA for disability with Agent Orange exposure. I have been diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. The Ponchatoula is on the list of ships for presumptive disability for being in the Mekong Delta in July of 71. I was on board on this cruise. I would like to know if you have or could supply me with the ship's roster so I could prove to the VA that I was aboard at that time. I was in Fox Division. As you know, the VA is difficult to deal with, and I would appreciate any help you can give me. Thank you. It's remarkable that even now we still have those calling out for help. After all this time, I don't have a name on this particular veteran, but knowing what some of these veterans have gone through, someone in particular that I know down in Kansas City that passed away just a few years ago, Vietnam veteran who suffered from the ravages of cancer due to his exposure to Agent Orange, the difficulties that he had in dealing with the VA, trying to prove the connection when I think to most of us it might seem rather obvious. My hat's off to all of our veterans and the things that they have endured, and our Vietnam veterans. Thank you for everything that you have done for us.
Thank you, Mr. President. From my years in service, I'd like to just add a little other context to this. When I was at the Air Force Academy, during this period of time, I did not serve in Vietnam, but I got to the Academy in 1970, and certainly studied what was going on in Vietnam. If your upperclassmen didn't realize you didn't know everything about everything that was going on, then you'd get in trouble. So we had to study it pretty hard. At that time, the Air Force was conducting operations called Operation Ranch Hand, and typically would use formations of 3 C-130s, which are very much like the C-130s we have here in Colorado that fight forest fires. And it's sort of the same idea. Instead of using them as slurry bombers, they would put Agent Orange in special tanks and spray them at pretty low level to start the process of defoliating jungle canopies. And that went on for a number of years. To put that into context, this is not the only problem our armed forces have had with environmental health issues. All the way back in World War II, when we were landing on the Anzio beachhead, there was a ship that came in loaded with mustard gas. The United States never used mustard gas in World War II, but there was a concern that if the Germans or the Italians used that in the theater, that we would have to respond in kind. Unfortunately, the only casualties of mustard gas that I know of in World War II was when that ship in Anzio Harbor blew up and killed about, I think it was about 350 men in that harbor. A lot of them were stevedores. Most of those were black units that were being used to transport the cargo on and off those ships. But it was a tragic accident. I can't remember if it was due to enemy fire or if, bombing, or if it was just an explosion on the ship. I think it was actually due to German fire. But it got out of hand. You may recall in the Gulf War, first Gulf War, that Saddam Hussein, knowing that he was losing ground, set fire to oil wells throughout that region. And we have had a number of veterans that have had very similar types of environmental diseases or syndromes resulting from that kind of environmental exposure. We did nuclear testing and exposed people, sometimes involuntarily, to low levels of nuclear radiation. And I have to say, as an Air Force analyst through a lot of my career, it is very difficult for any professionals, whether they're medical, whether they're mathematicians or whatever, to actually identify what the effects of environmental syndromes or environmental diseases are going to be. You don't know when they're going to happen. Our medical officers, our doctors, will diagnose patient by patient, and only when there is a vast amount of evidence over a statistically significant number of people
can they put these clues together as to what actually happened? And I think that was the case in the experience with Agent Orange and some other Gulf War syndrome. You've heard these types of nicknames because it's difficult to diagnose. It's difficult to categorize. But we know in the case of Agent Orange, we pretty well know that this is a cause and effect relationship. On a personal level, one of my best friends in my hometown, lived next door to my mother for many, many decades, was in Vietnam, was a victim of Agent Orange, and has suffered with that syndrome and that malady for decades. It has really ruined his life, and he went through years and years of the process of trying to be diagnosed, trying to apply for VA benefits, many times only to be turned down. As a part of a larger problem, the way we treat our veterans, especially those that are now seeking medical help, is really a national shame. I don't have the latest statistics. I know we still have not met our goals in the registration and the processing of claims in the Veteran Administration, but I know, I think in 2013 it hit a high in terms of the casualty claims backlog at over 600,000 claims that had not been processed. We have probably hundreds of thousands of people yet, veterans, who are dying before they can even apply for VA benefits. They put in their application, it's not processed for a year or 18 months, and not only are they denied the benefits, they're denied even the registration into the VA. What we're hearing today in Resolution 2 is a symptom of a larger problem that I hope we will see as an educational opportunity to understand that our constituents, our fellow Americans, our citizens who've served in the armed forces have largely been forgotten. And I thank you, Senator, for bringing this resolution forward, and I ask for your aye vote on Senate Resolution 2.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in support of 16002 and thank the sponsor very much. Like most people in this room, I was too young to serve during Vietnam. However, several years later, my junior year of college, I felt the calling, and I got up from my dorm room and I went down and I enlisted in the Colorado Army National Guard, where I proudly served for 6 years. But over half of our unit strength were made up of prior service people, and those were from Vietnam. They did their duty overseas, and then they came home and continued to do their duty as members of the Colorado Guard. They wanted to serve their country even more and their state. A finer group of guys you'd ever meet. They were proud, they were duty-bound, and they were heroes. Unfortunately, they weren't treated as heroes when they came back, which, as a good senator from Colorado Springs said, is a national disgrace. Well, now we have the opportunity to do that, do something about that. We need to change that. And so I would like to read this from a wife and caregiver of an Agent Orange exposed blue water Navy veteran. My husband was on the Ponchatoula on those dates given in 1969 and did go ashore into the Antoy Naval Base. Why does the VA see it so easy to reject his claim if they know he was aboard the USS Ponchatoula on that given month and year? My husband is dying from exposure to Agent Orange, multiple myeloma. Doctors have told us there is no cure for this illness. It's just a matter of time before he is taken from me. The VA has known for years about this exposure, but they continue to deny any claim. We need hard documents showing his ship was present there in Vietnam in 1969 when he was aboard the USS Ponchatoula. Just writing it on a piece of paper does not seem enough. I am very desperate. Our bills for his medical care are in the thousands, and I feel the VA needs to pay for all these bills before we lose our home.
Thank you, Madam President. And I too rise in support of Senate Resolution 2. It's always special when we do resolutions like this. You can tell with the tone of this place when a particular topic resonates across this entire floor. This place almost takes on a cathedral-like quality, and I think that's what we're experiencing today. It strikes me, and so I want to thank the good senator from Jefferson County for your diligent work in putting this together. Well done. We obviously come together to honor our veterans again, and we do that. So the words "thank you for your service" seem to ring hollow, as inadequate, but it's important that we say them. And so thank you. Important that we continue to, with that steady drumbeat of thanks, recognition. But as if we heard these stories, powerful, powerful stories, there's another element to them that just seems sad and almost tragic. And you hear the drumbeat of, why does the VA not recognize our story? The reference to those old boys who don't hear so good, or do you have any other information that could maybe help me make my case? What a tragic commentary. As was commented, this is us turning on ourselves and not doing what's right. So it's important that we do this. Sometimes we reflect on these things and we wonder, okay, here we are, one of 50, and we're taking time to do this. We all know our schedule. We all know how busy it is. We all see the calendar and say, man, we got a lot of things to do. But how appropriate it is that we slow the boat down, that we take the time, that we do the appropriate honoring that needs to be done here, and maybe send a message, because that's what's at the conclusion of this resolution, a message to the folks outside of Colorado that says, hey, hear our voice. Hear the voice of the people that have taken the time to come to this building and sit in our perimeter and make themselves known and seen and heard. Important that we recognize them and send that message to folks outside of Colorado and say, hey, you need to listen. You need to hear these stories. We've heard them here in Colorado. Please listen to them so that the tragic commentary on our agencies out of Washington is not, boy, I wish they heard us more. I wish they recognized. I wish they would do something. So in addition to the honoring that's gone on today, I hope that voice goes forth from this place and really serves as a continuing ripple. If you see the analogy to water, that it might grow larger and larger and larger until those voices are heard, until something is done, until these diseases and the ramifications and the consequences are heard, that appropriate redress is afforded to those that so richly deserve it. It's an honor to be in this place, an honor to participate in this resolution.
Thank you, Madam President. First of all, I'd like to thank the senator from Jefferson County that brought this resolution. I'd also like to thank the Blue Water sailors that are here today. Thank you for your sacrifice. Thank you for the time that you spent there in that country, defending our country. I've got a story from someone here that we all know. One way or another, we are all connected to this individual. And I wanted to read it. It's a personal story from him that says, I really appreciate the introduction of the resolution concerning Blue Water sailors. I am one of those folks impacted by the government's arbitrary decision to exclude us from the Agent Orange related health problems. By way of background, I was damage control officer on the USS Kilauea, AE-26, from 1969 to 1972. The Kilauea was an ammunition ship, but also supplied over other ships with food, oil, jet fuel, etc. During that time, we were deployed to the South China Sea and Vietnam War zone for a total of more than 24 months on 2 separate deployments. Our primary mission was to rearm aircraft carriers, usually with 500-pound and 1,000-pound bombs, and destroyers and cruisers with 5- and 8-inch shells. To accomplish our mission, we cruised a couple of miles off the coast of Vietnam. usually for about 4 to 6 weeks at a time, rearming the carriers at night for daylight bombing runs and destroyers and cruisers during the daylight hours for offshore bombardment at night. Because of our proximity to land, I remember well seeing the pockmarked landscape where Agent Orange had been used for defoliation of the jungle. Because the Kilauea was more than 700 foot long and about 22,000 pounds displaced and 30-foot draft, we couldn't enter into the brown water of Vietnam, but we certainly were within several miles of the coastline for weeks at a time. And being a self-sufficient U.S. Navy ship, we were making our own drinking water, cooking and bathing water from the seawater contaminated with Agent Orange. Beginning in about 1987, I began regular visits to the dermatologist for skin cancer and related issues. For nearly 25 years, I was on a 3-month appointment schedule. For the last couple of years, I've been on a every other month schedule, and just recently, I went to a once a month schedule. I routinely have between 5 and 10 biopsies every year. Luckily, they have all come back either squamous cell or basal cell cancer with no melanoma. I have had numerous skin cancer surgeries over the years. Also in 2007, I was diagnosed with prostate cancer and a successful prostate I'm sorry, I can't pronounce it. The doctor will help me do that later. Skin cancer and prostate cancer seem to be one of the diseases that is the main cancer caused by the exposure of Agent Orange. I have made several claims to the VA about the cancers, all supported by the statements from the dermatologist and my urologist, and have been told by the VA that because I was never in Brown Water Navy, I don't qualify for any of the treatment, benefits, or other rights related to the cancer. For my hearing loss and being near the naval guns, being in the flight deck safety officer, and in the engine room of the ship, for that matter, I wish you well on the success of the resolution and appreciate your efforts on my behalf. Thank you very much, Danny Tomlinson. I spoke with Danny several times on this issue. If you can't prove that you were on the shore of Vietnam, which many of these individuals that are here today, they did leave the ship. They flew supplies inland on helicopters, flew supplies back. There was actual pictures taken of them standing on the ground, and the VA says, that doesn't prove anything. You can't prove that where that picture was taken. So there are some individuals that has been dismissed that should not be dismissed. Again, I wanted to thank all of you that's here this morning, and I stand in support of SJR 2.
Thank you, Madam President. Colleagues, I have another story that I want to share with you this morning, and this story is about a gentleman who's here today with his son. One of our honored guests is Joe. His son is Richard. Joe's a Vietnam veteran who served as a helicopter crewman, mechanic, and gunner in Vietnam on a Marine Corps helicopter, the H-34, in 1964. He re-enlisted for Army Flight School in '66, graduating in May of '67, and starting in September of '67, he served in Vietnam as a helicopter pilot for the Army. He logged somewhere between 500 and 600 hours of flight time in the Army. When flying gunships, he made gun runs at treetop level and flew near all kinds of places that had been sprayed with Agent Orange. He and his Army crew supported the river gunboats on the tributaries and the rivers of Vietnam. He was considered Brown Water Navy. Now, currently, Joe has no known disease or problems from Agent Orange exposure. it appears that burden has been passed on to his beloved son, Richard. Richard is here this morning. He would enjoy meeting each and every one of you. Richard has 34 different abnormalities, some from birth, others manifesting throughout his life. The abnormalities are extreme, affecting his brain, his facial structure, his lungs, his kidneys, his GI tract, his joints, his genitals. He's unable to speak, he has seizures, and he is blind. But despite all of this, he's a good man, he's a happy man, and he has purpose to his life. The VA denies coverage for the children of the men who served in Vietnam, but they allow coverage of the women's children, women who served there. If their children are born with birth defects, they're covered, but not the men's children. Again, it's another travesty dished to our soldiers. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you for joining us today, and I want to thank the sponsor for running this resolution. As the good senator from Douglas County mentioned, there are some of us around 55 years old here who were kids when Vietnam was happening. My dad was in Vietnam. Many of you have met my dad. Those who didn't meet him probably heard about him here a couple times during a couple debates. And there's certainly a lot more people that have now read about him from some of the stories that I've shared over the years. To say my dad has a temper is an understatement. And I know I've shared the characteristics of that and what it meant on my family, but what I haven't shared many times was my dad was also in the Navy in Vietnam in the late 60s. And I remember those days. It was strange. You're 9 years old. You think the war is never going to end because it's on TV every day. Your neighbors aren't coming home. A very good friend didn't come home. And you're only 9 or 10. My brother was a couple years older, and we just kept thinking, oh, we're going to enlist in a few years because it seemed like it was never going to end for us. The war was so bad for my dad. The photos he took, he still won't show me, and I am well past the age that he served. He was an aviation mechanic, an aircraft mechanic, a helicopter mechanic, and he was on those ships, and he was also on land. He was the one that was tasked with repairing the helicopters so quickly they didn't have time to clean them out. They literally used a squeegee, and then they started repairing them so they could get them back into service. Most of them were medevacs. He suffers, he complains. I mentioned his temper. Mostly, he has it under control until you mention those two letters together, V and A. If you say VA, you better hold the phone away from your head, and it's deserved. I just want to take this opportunity to share the good side of my dad, because there's a lot to him that I haven't shared. The good side was that he served. The good side for us was that he did come home. The good side is he still fights for the causes he believes in, and he's almost 80, and he has colleagues that he helps that are suffering. A few weeks ago, I made headlines with 4 simple words. I said, Congress, do your job. And within minutes, it was like that was the shot heard round the world. Different issue, somewhat controversial. I stand by it. Congress, do your job. And I think about Congress failing us. I think about that monument to failure of a veterans hospital has yet to serve a veteran. Has yet to serve a veteran. We're failing those who didn't fail to serve us. I want to thank the senator from Boulder for sharing, because as you shared, I thought about my dad, and it compelled me to come here and share. I haven't had as many opportunities to thank my dad for what he's done. I'm going to take that now. And all of you, maybe some of you served with him. I think it's time, I hope this makes headlines. I think it's time for Congress to do their job, and I want to thank all of our veterans for doing your job.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, colleagues. I renew my motion for the adoption of Senate Resolution 002.
Colleagues, we'll take a brief recess. We want to ask our guests to please stand so we can recognize them.
Introduce yourself, Ben.